Hey, Professor Rapetti here, and we're going to discuss in this lecture the myth of Gyges by Plato. This comes out of Plato's Republic, and it's all about a magical ring. Now, Plato refers to this in his book, The Republic, as the myth of Gyges. So 2,400 years ago, this was then considered a myth from an earlier era. Remember, Plato mentions Atlantis in some of his writings. He's not the only one. And Atlantis was an advanced civilization with super technology that had kind of power and technology beyond its moral development, and it destroyed itself. It was, pardon me, an alleged island civilization near Greece. Okay, just keep that in mind. Okay, so these are the two questions that this, I'll call it a thought experiment. You know, philosophers don't use test tubes. We use what we call thought experiments. What if? Imagine this scenario and you're in it. What would you do? Right? And the thought experiments in philosophy are designed to get you to think outside the box and just put yourself in someone else's shoes and try to figure things out by looking at them from a different perspective. Inside out, upside down, backwards, forwards, and then some. Okay, so two of the major questions that Plato's story of the myth of Gyges and the ring, two questions that the myth raises, or Plato's mentioning the myth raises, are: one, is human nature inherently selfish? Are we always really just selfish human beings? Right? Like there's a sense in which each one of us is the center of the movie or the narrative, which is our life, and everybody else is kind of like extras on the set, other actors who are supporting actors, right? But we are like the main actor in our own stories, right? So in a way, almost everything that we do might really reasonably be construed to be somewhat selfish. So is human nature, are we by definition, is that the way that we are? And the other question is whether or not we're that way, whether we're or not, like maybe we are, maybe we're not, but regardless, do we have good reasons to be moral? And implicitly, the idea is that by being moral, that means not necessarily always being selfish. And it's an open question whether or not being selfish is good. All right, I'll have more to say about that at some other point. All right. Oh, and by the way, that's a picture from The Lord of the Rings. You know, and the ring story in The Lord of the Rings, you know, the magical ring that has magical powers in it, it goes back at least to Plato's myth of Gyges. Okay, so there's a mechanical horse, which is pretty cool looking. I wish I had one of those, because you don't even have to feed it or clean up after it. All right. So the story goes, there's a shepherd out in the hills with his flock, and he sees a deep hole in the earth with a huge metal horse in it, broken open. Now, think about that. And then inside this big broken horse is a dead creature, a being described as a being larger than human, right? That's interesting. He has a ring on. Gyges sees the ring and takes it. Grave robber. Later on, he's playing with the ring. He's fiddling it. There's a ring there. Wow, Professor Rapetti became invisible. Gyges becomes invisible. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that sounds like alien or UFO stealth invisibility technology. Think about it, right? Like how the hell could Plato have a myth about this 2,400 years ago with Atlantis being in the background, right? An advanced, technologically advanced civilization, right? Like if there was a technologically advanced civilization, it could create things like this mechanical horse, which would be like a motor vehicle, right? I would imagine like if you had machinery, engineering, intelligence, you could say, wow, horses move really fast. You could build a machine that functioned like a horse, right? But it would be big, and it would be like an earthbound spaceship, right? Something that you could use to travel around on the earth. Could be aliens, could be an advanced human civilization, whatever, right? It's just, to me, a lot of ancient myths, the way that they strike me, they make me think of X-Files stories. Like, there might be some ordinary way of explaining this, right? Where these myths come from. All right, that's neither here nor there, and it's not really relevant to the story, okay? But what is relevant is that Gyges uses the ring to become invisible, to sneak into a castle past the guards, and seduce the queen. Now, I don't know how being invisible helps you seduce the queen. What do? Go over and tickle her ear when she's sleeping? I mean, I don't know. This just sounds really fishy, I don't want to think about the details, too much information. In any event, he seduces the queen somehow, kills the king. I can imagine how an invisible person could easily kill a king, but I just don't know how being invisible could get you to seduce a queen. But, what do I know? I haven't had the invisibility ring. And he takes over the kingdom. Okay. So, Plato raises the question for reasons that we'll get into shortly. But before we do, right, what would you do with the ring? Now, there's a picture of, the invisible man. And the invisible man wears a suit and a hat. All you see is the clothing, right? Really put yourself in this situation. 9 out of 10 of my students, and I've been teaching since 1991, 01, 11, 20. That's 30 years that I've been teaching college students. 30 years and a half, because it was the spring semester of 1991. No, the summer semester that I began. Whatever. And I almost always bring this up. And the answers are almost always the same. What would you do with the ring? The first thing that most students say is, pause to think about this. Pause the video. Think about it. What would you do? And then come back. All right. End of warning. Here's the answer. You'd rob a bank. Go for the money, man. Right? Yeah, you wouldn't even need to put that little mask on because you're invisible. Next thing you might do, I shouldn't have shown that first. What else might you do? Spy on people. All those people that that you wonder, what do they think? What, are they saying something about you? Is she cheating on you? Is he cheating on you? Go look through their stuff to see if they're the one, you're missing something. Maybe you think, your friend stole it last time he was over the house, whatever. I once found my stolen stamp collection in my best friend's house. We're still good friends. Actually, we've been friends since age 3 because our mothers were friends. He's my longest lasting friend, even though he stole my stamps, because he gave them back to me and apologized. Oh, I shouldn't have shown. I keep forgetting to ask you first. Well, here's another thing some of the more devious students among you might do. I don't know if you've ever seen that picture, but when I was, your age and a lot younger, in the back of comic books, and like maybe even in the wrappers from Bazooka Gum or something like that, there were these advertisements for X-ray specs, they called them. If you wear the X-ray specs, you could see through people's clothing. And of course, boys would think, ooh, I got to get me a pair of those. I actually never followed through and ordered them. I don't remember what they cost. All right, what else might you do? That's pretty devious. Right? But, if you got the power, if you got the ring, right, you wouldn't really need to be able to look through somebody's clothes, because you could sneak into their room when they were getting undressed. You'd be like, a peeping Tom, as we call it. I don't know if you're familiar with that phrase, but that's like when somebody drills a hole in the wall to look through the room and see somebody who's getting undressed and whatnot, right? Peeping Tom. So you can kind of see people disrobe and whatnot. What else might you do? Pause the video. Think about it. Make a little list. This is a really interesting experiment. What would you do if you could be invisible? Like, look, what's the main benefit of being invisible? Nobody knows that you did it, right? No consequences. You could get away with murder. I think that's pretty awesome, isn't it? Wouldn't it be great? What would you do? Oh, look at the picture. Vengeance. Aren't there some people you want to get even with? And you could get even with them and they would never know that it was you. What else might you do? I think if you've been pausing and thinking what else you do, this is like one of the standard sequences of the kinds of answers that most of my students for the last 30 years have been giving me. It's almost always the same. For years, I did this without having the PowerPoint. PowerPoints are a relatively recent thing in my teaching toolbox. All right, so what's the next thing you might do? Oh, justice, right? Because vengeance is a form of justice. Yeah, get even with people. Take down the bullies or whoever you think the bad guys are. Go after the bad guys. Vigilante. Oh, Robin Hood, yes. Steal from the rich who don't deserve all that wealth and give it to the poor, especially you and your family and friends who might be poor. What else might you do? Vigilante. Oh, I mentioned that already. Yes, it's part of vengeance and justice. Vigilante. Got some gangbanger in your neighborhood who terrorizes everybody. You just sneak up on him and hit him in the head with a 2x4. He'll turn around and be nobody there. I would love that power. Well, that's just me. Prankster, yes. Usually after we hear all these other answers, there'll be one smart aleck in the back of the room who'll raise their hand and say, Professor, I'd like to pull some pranks on some people. I could identify with that. I like the idea of teasing people. It's part of my prankster nature. I'm like the prankster in, what was that Netflix series? Supernatural. The prankster was actually what? Some god, Loki or something, I forget. Oh, look at that. Yeah, usually after all this selfish, vindictive, derelict degenerates in the class answer all those other things like I myself would do, there's usually some nice person in the back who raises their hand and say, Professor, I would go around helping people. And I don't mean to laugh at them, but like, do you really need superpowers to be nice? Oh, well, but I could understand. Yeah, why not? Go around helping. You see somebody who needs help and you go help them and they don't even have to know that it was you. Okay. So you'll notice in the middle of the screen, there's a picture of a microphone. I'm not going to play that because I tested it and my recorded lectures from when I made this PowerPoint, you can't hear them if I play them while I'm recording this video, right? But you can go back when you want to go back and review these slides. You can actually you click on that when you are playing it and it'll play another version of my same lecture for each slide, okay? So here's a question that one of Plato's brothers seems to be raising when he alleges to Socrates in the dialogue. Plato has Socrates as the main character and his two brothers in this part of the dialogue. By the way, this is just a snippet of a dialogue that comes out of the Republic, which I mentioned earlier, but each little segment of the Republic has Socrates arguing with different people. And when he's talking about the ring, he's talking to Plato's two brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus. All right. And one of the brothers, I forget which, it doesn't matter which one, you can just kind of lop them together as Plato's brothers. One of them argues that anybody would abuse the ring, even like a really upright, morally good, pious, virtuous, moral, holy man, a saint. If they had this power, they would abuse the ring, right? So the question is, would everyone, well, the question on the previous slide was, would you abuse the ring, right? Whether or not you do it doesn't mean that everybody's just like you, right? So the new question is, would everybody abuse the ring if they had the opportunity? Like Mother Teresa, she's like the kind of model, altruistic, selfless, community service, help the poor, blah, 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 oriented, good person, right? Well, one of Plato's brothers thinks, yeah, nobody's immune. Give anybody a chance. And why? What's the idea? Think about that. Why does one of Plato's brothers think anyone would abuse the ring? What about this guy, Martin Luther King? The guy sacrificed his life for racial justice, right? By the way, while we're on that subject, when Martin Luther King devoted his life to racial justice, one of the things that he said most famously was that he wanted his children to grow up in a world where they would be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. Nowadays, it happens to be not Black folks who are making that remark, but white folks, because this new theory taking over the country called critical race theory is saying that, well, we're in a kind of white supremacist, racist society. All whites are automatically thereby prejudiced, right? They're the ones with the problem, right? And if you're white, you're automatically a bigot. And if you're a person of color, you're automatically innocent. And like your character has nothing to do with your moral virtue or moral guilt, right? It's like the complete opposite of what Martin Luther King advocated. I'm just mentioning that while we got Martin on the screen there. All right, something to think about. But yeah, that aside, that was another tangent, and I can't help myself by bringing up things that are relevant to today. But, would he abuse the ring if he had the opportunity? That's a question for you to decide. What about Gandhi? In fact, Gandhi was like Martin Luther King Jr.'s like philosophical and ethical guru, right? He learned civil disobedience from Gandhi, right? Shame your oppressors by acting more noble than them. Call them to stand up to their own professed claims of moral righteousness. All men, it says, in our governing documents in this wonderful country are created equal, right? We have a kind of God-given right, inalienable rights given to us by God, who sees us all equal, right? Martin Luther King and Gandhi were like, yeah, man, you Brits in India, you're not treating us as equal. Martin Luther King, yeah, you white folks in the United States are not treating us Black folks as equal. What the hell, right? Be consistent with your spoken commitments. You talk a good talk, but you don't live it, all right? So people like Gandhi and King, they sacrificed their lives. Gandhi got shot, King got shot. These people are up there, with any other martyr, right? What's her name over there? Mother Teresa, she didn't get shot, right? She just happened to help the poor a lot, specifically in India. But would folks like that abuse the ring? That's what one of Plato's brothers thinks. He thinks nobody's immune to that. Like, they think that the only reason that anybody's ever morally good is because they're afraid of getting caught. And if you could be invisible to men and gods, because the Greeks thought the gods were not all-knowing and all-seeing and everywhere, they were limited. They had a messenger god, Hermes, who brought messages from one to the other. If they were all-knowing, they would not need Hermes, right? So if you had the invisibility ring, according to the Greek polytheists, you'd be invisible not only to human beings, but to God. So you could get away with anything. So if the three people you're looking at had that ring, one of Plato's brothers thinks, they'd abuse it. Why wouldn't they? Why shouldn't they? What about Abraham, right? The first patriarch of the Judeo-Christian Islamic monotheistic religious complex, right? Who was willing to kill his own innocent son because God asked him to do it. He was willing to forego his own moral conscience and trust a higher power. God rewarded him and all his offspring and their offspring and all their offspring's offspring and so on for all eternity, the chosen people, because of that one singular act, right? Whoa, what a noble guy. Plato's brother thinks, yeah, give him the ring and see how he behaves, right? Now, what about this woman, the mother of Jesus, right? Are there no truly moral people? One of Plato's brothers, I don't know if he really believes it, but he's making the argument, maybe just for the sake of the argument, right? And we'll say more about that shortly. But that, like, it's reasonable to think anybody might abuse the ring, which implies that the only reason that people are moral is when they're afraid of getting caught and having to face the consequences imposed on them externally by someone able to impose those consequences, whether it's the law, the tyrant, your parents, the school teachers, God, whatever, right? In other words, what these people are saying is that morals are baloney and they're only about getting caught and not getting caught. Because if you could get away with anything, you would, and so would anybody else. I don't care how holy or roly, or whatever else you want to call them, that they are. Okay? All right. So the view that we're all ultimately just selfish and we don't really care about morals, right, breaks down into two different types of versions of that view. Well, first of all, that view is called egoism. Ego in Latin means I, right? Ego, I, the self, right? Egoism or egoism is self-ism, so to speak, right? I'm all that matters, like narcissism, right? But there are two different kinds. One is psychological, in the yellow posted on the left in the diagram, or descriptive in the right side under the first bullet. Those are the same thing. Psychological egoism says it's a descriptive theory. It purports to describe how we actually are, and says how we actually are is that we actually are always selfish, right? Like one of Plato's brothers is saying, like, no matter who had the ring, if you could get away with it, you'd be selfish. Everybody only cares about themselves, right? You're the center of your own biography, the center of your cognitive universe. You're the main character in your life story. Everybody else is a kind of extra on the scene, right? Psychological egoism says we do actually act in our own self-interest always. It's impossible for us not to, right? That's just the way that we are. We're selfish animals, right? Ethical egoism, in the pink post-it in the diagram, or the second bullet on the right, is prescriptive. It prescribes. When somebody describes, they say how things are. When they prescribe, they're saying how things ought to be or should be, right? So prescriptive egoism is also called ethical egoism, right? And ethical egoism prescribes that we should always act in our own self-interest, which sounds a kind of unusual, right? Usually ethical theories tell you to be unselfish and act in other people's interests. But I mean, it's an ethical theory, just like any other hypothesis, theory, or claim. This one says, well, actually, there are ethical reasons to think that every single one of us should be selfish, right? It's an interesting theory, especially because almost nobody holds that theory, right? When almost nobody holds any theory, pay attention to it, because as Plato will explain to us in the next video lecture, sometimes the one person who seems insane to everybody else is the only person who's actually sane, right? The mere fact that nobody believes something is not necessarily an automatic reason to reject it. It might actually be the opposite. It might be automatically a reason to wonder, why might somebody think that? And could it be true? Okay, moving right along. Let's play the descriptive egoism game. So remember, descriptive egoism says human beings are always selfish. Prescriptive egoism says human beings always should be, selfish. So we are selfish, that's descriptive. That describes how we are. We should be selfish, that's prescriptive. That's prescribing how we are. Like, here's your prescription. You should take 2 of these a day and get lots of sleep, drink lots of fluids, right? So we're going to do the descriptive one first. And this is a game. I like to call it a game. A game, is it a game everyone always plays? That's a kind of ironic question, because according to descriptive egoism or psychological egoism, which says the way our psychology works, we're always actually selfish, right? So here's how we play this game. You imagine, or I imagine, some allegedly, obviously unselfish action, right? And then someone else in the class, and this is really a lot of fun when we do it in a live class when there's feedback, but I'm going to try to mock that, have a mock class right now. I'll play different roles. It's a lot of fun. Somebody says, oh, well, this is obviously unselfish. And then the proponent, or the opponent rather, proponent, the one who proposes the thing, the opponent is the one who opposes it, says, well, you know what? I can imagine a possibly hidden selfish reason that would explain that allegedly unselfish action. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples, right? And look at the diagram down below. It's all about me, 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 me. I mean, really, 99% of everything that we do is about us, okay? But philosophically, that doesn't necessarily tell us the truth of the matter philosophically. Okay, let's consider a sample, right? We'll give a sample of, on the left side of the column, an allegedly unselfish action, and then we'll give a sample of a possibly selfish reason why somebody might perform what looks like a possibly unselfish action. Okay, so here's one. You give money to a beggar when there's nobody there to see it on the street. You're walking down the street or you're driving your car, you stop at a light, there's a beggar there, there's nobody around, nobody, and you give the guy $1 or a quarter or whatever it is, right? That seems unselfish. What do you get out of it, right? You get nothing out of it. Nobody will ever know that you did it. That guy will never see you again or remember you again. You'll never see him or remember him again. There's no possible consequence that'll come out of it, right? Okay, now think about how somebody who does that might be doing it for a possibly hidden, maybe even hidden to them, selfish reason, before I click on the screen and show you one possible answer. And remember, throughout these videos, whenever you need to think about something, hit the pause button. I don't mind. I can't even tell. All right, here's one possible hidden selfish reason. You just hope to make yourself feel better about yourself, right? Maybe for some reason or another, you've got a little bit of low self-esteem, or you're a little down on yourself. You feel a little guilty about something, or maybe it's in the back of your head and you don't even have full access to that. But, or for whatever reason, if you do that, you yourself will feel better. You'll feel better about yourself, and it'll give you a little feeling of glow. I'm a good person, right? And so, you know what? I could pay $1 to make myself feel like a good person. And then I could drive home happy knowing that I did some good in the world. And you got all that kind of psychological feedback. That's a possible hidden selfish reason, no? Let's look at another case. Once again, pause this at any time, because some of these things you need to pause and just really think about them. Okay, next one. Like me, you devote your life to teaching, kids from the inner city, from the projects, kids who went to crappy high schools, whose reading level is like 7th grade, and you're trying to uplift them and teach them some philosophical thinking so they could fix their lives and have a life plan and make something of themselves and find meaning, right? And like doing that, right? That seems like a completely unselfish thing. Like anybody who has a PhD like me in philosophy, I could get a job working in some cognitive neuroscience lab. I could be in a law firm making a $500,000 a year with my, cognitive and intellectual and verbal skills. I'm absolutely certain of it, right? So like, I'm obviously doing something that's on its face, like clearly unselfish. It's an unselfish thing to do, right? Or could there be some hidden, unbeknownst to me, selfish reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing? Let's see. Well, pause the screen and think about it, and then come back. All right, time's up. Oh, maybe when I was younger, I was pretty selfish and I hurt a lot of people and I have a lot of guilt. And this is like a way to try to have some kind of personal redemption, because as you get older and you get closer to the inevitable death and possible afterlife, maybe you want to try to, make amends, do a little good, cultivate some good karma to kind of outweigh all your bad karma. It's possible, right? It's hard to know because we often do, pardon my French, bullshit ourselves in many different ways. Okay. Let's see. Do we have one more here? Oh, yeah. Here's one. The suicide bomber. This guy gives his life. I mean, I'm giving my life slowly, and it's a very slow and torturous death, teaching students. Sorry, I'm just trying to make you laugh a little bit. I can't have all my lectures be too serious because then you'll be bored to death. But well, no, really, think of the suicide bomber. I mean, he might have some deranged beliefs, but unless he's being like coerced because they've got his family and they're going to kill them unless he goes and suicide bombs himself, right? Because you've seen that in maybe some kind of movies, right? But think about the suicide bomber who's a believer, who thinks that, the cause is so much greater than me that it would be the most honorable thing that I could do if I give my life destroying those enemies of ours, right? Kamikaze pilot crashes his plane into an American ship during World War II, or some jihadist, whatever, right? Doesn't matter. Suicide bombers is just one example of the kinds of warriors who are willing to commit suicide and thereby take down a lot of the enemy, right? Who they perceive to be the enemy. They believe they're on the side of justice and they're willing to sacrifice their entire life, right? With the loss to all their friends and loved ones of their being in their lives and everything else. They have such faith that there's life after death and that this is meaningful, right? I'm not trying to justify them, but I mean, let's take it from their perspective. They must believe something like that, right? Otherwise they wouldn't do it. So this seems to be a totally unselfish. I mean, there can't be anything more unselfish than giving your life. Well, living through a lot of suffering, devoting your life to helping others, and dying to help others, both of those are kind of similar. And it's really hard to tell which could be more unselfish. It might be pretty selfish to say, oh, I'll go out in a blaze of glory. I'll suffer for about 10 seconds before I actually die, or 2 seconds, as opposed to suffering for 30 years doing what Professor Rapati does. Just kidding. I love teaching. So I'm just joking around. All right. Is there some hidden selfish reason? that somebody might do that? Pause the video, think about it, and then come back. Yeah, I'll go straight to heaven. Right? In fact, if you're one of these jihadist suicide bombers, not only will you go straight to heaven, but you will be rewarded with 70 something, I forget the number, like celestial nymph virgins or something like that. It's like a porno fantasy, porno virgin utopia. That's what I hear anyway. I don't know. That might be an exaggeration, but I believe that there's something to it. So the point is, look, for any one of these things that you think, oh, here's an action that clearly seems completely unselfish, right? This is the egoism game, right? A game everyone always plays, right? If psychological egoism is true, then we're all always playing some version of this game when we act like we're really good people, but there's always some hidden motive, okay? You sacrificed your life jumping on the grenade. You're in the army, you're in Baghdad or Afghanistan or wherever the hell it is, right? And there's like an attack on, your little convoy and whatever. There's a grenade thrown right near you and your friends, and you jump on the grenade, which will shield your friends as your body explodes, right? Wow, nothing better than that. Pause the video. Can you think of a selfish explanation? Okay. Yeah, to die a hero, earning some sort of honor or fame, going to heaven, whatever. Maybe your life back at home really sucks. And, you're just like, you're on the brink of meaninglessness anyway. And so like the least you could do is go out in a blaze of glory, thinking that everybody's going to love you and praise you, and you will live on in their memories as some hero, right? And those are reasonably understood as selfish motives, right? All right. Any other examples? You think about it. At your homework, informally. I will not be grading you on this homework, but this is something you might want to have a conversation with your family or friends about, or think about yourself. If Plato's brothers are right, then you're always selfish, no matter what you do. And nobody is more or less selfish than you. All human beings are necessarily always acting in their own self-interest, no matter what they say or seem to be doing that appears to be or sounds like it's unselfish. That's the claim of psychological egoism. And I have colleagues at Kingsborough in the psychology department who think that that's true, although they don't have the whatever it takes to debate me on this issue. All right, moving right along. Yeah, oh, sorry, yeah. So imagine any other examples of obviously unselfish things. And then imagine if you could think of some possibly selfish reasons for those things. All right, moving right along. Okay, prescriptive egoism, right? Ethical egoism is the theory that says, ethically speaking, the right thing for you to do morally is to be selfish. Now that seems completely insane and contrary to everything any preacher, religion, father figure, school teacher, moralist, or anybody else ever said, right? This is a very, very peculiar, unique, rare, obviously backward theory, right? Should you be selfish? So Plato's brothers, there's their names spelled out in case you couldn't tell from my pronunciation, Glaucon and Adeimantus. And they challenged Socrates with something like this. You preachers, teachers, lawmakers, elders, you moralists, you holy rollers, you parents, you grandparents, you traditionalists, you've always taught us that the reason to be good is that we'll be rewarded for being good. And the reason that we should not be bad is that we'll be punished for being bad one way or another, either in this life, either legally, socially, economically, or politically, or in the next life, in the afterworld, right? There's something very intuitive about that. And think about that. 2,300 and some odd years ago, Plato's brothers and Plato and Socrates had this kind of debate. Pretty interesting, no? Pretty relevant today, no? This implies that there are no what we call intrinsic reasons to be good. That is, reasons that are independent of the consequences, right? Like pleasure is intrinsically a positive experience, and pain is intrinsically a negative experience in and of itself, regardless of any of the consequences that may come from things that cause pleasure or pain. The pleasure itself is intrinsically attractive and pleasant and desirable, and the pain is intrinsically negative, avoidable, aversive, etc. Right? The one has a positive value in and of itself, no matter whatever else happens. Pleasure is good and pain is bad, independently of anything else. It's just an example of what a thing might be that's intrinsically good or intrinsically bad. And if you think back on my very first, well, in the first week, I forget what number the lecture was. I think it was the last lecture in the first week, which was about what's my philosophy of life, where I talked about, I want to go to school. Why? Oh, because I want to get good grades. Why? Because I want to get a degree. Why? Because with that degree, I can get a job. Why do you want to have a job? Because if I have a good job, I can make a lot of money. Why do you want a lot of money? So I could buy a lot of things. Why do you want to be able to buy a lot of things or experiences? Because if I can do the things I want to do, then I'll be happy, right? So happiness is intrinsically good, but all those other things leading to it, they're not necessarily intrinsically good in and of themselves. They're only good because they can bring about something else that you value in and of itself. So the things that you value in and of themselves are intrinsically good, right? So intrinsic reasons are like that, right? So what Plato's brothers are saying is that, like, you preachers have always tried to use instrumental things to get us to be good and to get us to avoid being evil. If we're good, we'll be rewarded. If we're evil, we'll be punished. But you haven't shown us that there are any kinds of reasons that are independent of punishment and reward, why we should be good and why we should avoid being evil. Intrinsic reasons, reasons why for their own sake. Is there any reason why for its own sake I should be good, other than, oh, I'll be rewarded, or why I shouldn't be bad because, oh, I'll be punished, right? And in fact, if I have that ring, that eliminates all the consequences, all the punishments and rewards. So if I could eliminate all the consequences, is there no reason why I should be good or why I shouldn't be evil? Right? That's the question that Plato's brothers are pressing against Socrates. Is there any intrinsic reason to be good? Like if I had that ring, and Plato's the one who brings it up, right? What if you had the ring? If you had the ring, would you have any reason to be good? Because now you don't have to worry about the consequences, the punishments, or the rewards. It's a brilliant thought experiment, right? It really gets you to think about, why are you good when you're good? Are you just trying to avoid punishment? That's something really important and deep to think about, okay? Okay. So if the only reason why you're being good is to avoid the consequences, then morality has no real meaning. It has no intrinsic value. It's all bullshit, basically, right? Okay. Are there intrinsic reasons to be good? Reasons that are independent of the consequences? That's what the Gyges ring thought experiment gets you to address. Should you be good? even if you won't be caught being bad. So Plato's brothers, like to drive the point home, say, Socrates, if you could convince us of that, like that we should be good regardless of the consequences, right? Even if I'll never suffer a negative consequence for being bad, if you could convince me that even under that scenario, I should be good, right? Then we would police ourselves. We'd worry more about whether or not we were good than about whether or not anybody else is, or whether or not anybody ever gets caught or punished or gets just desserts or anything like that. We would each police our own souls if you could really make us understand why we should be ethical. Not just because we'll be punished if we're not, and we'll be rewarded if we are. Is that all it is? That's like training a horse with the carrot and the stick. If the horse behaves and does what you want it to do, you give it the carrot, which it wants. It eats the carrot. If it disbehaves or misbehaves or whatever, you hit it with the stick. Pain and suffering, right? What are we, like animals? Are we dumb, ignorant animals? That's the only thing that motivates us? Are we always so selfish and banal and simple that that's it? The carrot and the stick, the punishment and the reward? You guys are the moral geniuses, the moral philosophers. Can't you give us a reason to be good that's independent of that silly thing that we do, that we tell children? Is there no adult reason to be good for its own sake? That's the challenge, right? It's a pretty good challenge. Okay. Not only is that a good challenge, but Plato's brothers say, you know what? And to really convince us that you're giving us a non-bullshit answer, let's make the challenge even harder. Let's reverse the consequences for punishment and reward, right? If there really are reasons to be good that are independent of the consequences of being caught being bad, right, or being rewarded for being good, that is, if there are really intrinsic reasons, not just instrumental reasons, because it'll lead to this or that, but because it's good in and of itself, then I should prefer choice A over choice B in the following. Choice A, I should prefer to be truly good, despite even constantly being punished for good deeds by bad consequences. Here's some bad consequences: poverty, no money at all; weakness, illness, sickness, disease; a bad and terrible reputation; terrible pain; imprisonment; torture; having my eyes gouged out, right? There's the picture of the guy being the holy man. There's the monk in the picture, right? Being whipped by somebody in a prison cell, right? I should prefer to be him rather than the guy below, the gangster with the bling and the women and all the fun and the drugs, right? B, I should prefer to be the good man who's constantly tortured over being the bad man who, despite constantly being bad, is rewarded for bad deeds by good consequences, right? I'm an evil, vicious lowlife, right? But I'm always rewarded with money, power, reputation, pleasures, women, gold, drugs, happiness, music videos, you name it, freedoms. I can do anything. I live like a king, right? I'm like a mob boss or a gang leader, right? And everybody bows down to me and honors me. And, you know, why should I prefer to be the good man who constantly suffers and loses and is abused, rather than being evil and being rewarded? If morals really matter, if there is such a thing as intrinsic reasons to be moral, convince me of that, and then I will prefer choice A over choice B. Now that's a really tall order, right? It's like, all bullshit aside, Socrates, you know, you're a moralist. You talk about the care of the soul and virtue and wisdom and all that other stuff. Let's get real, all right? We see these lowlives who manage to, you know, enjoy life at everybody else's expense while the good person is suffering always, you know? That's the reality, man. Get real, Socrates. All right, put your money on the table. Prove your point. Prove to me why I should prefer to be good while being tortured as opposed to being bad while being constantly rewarded. Right? That's the second and greater challenge. Reverse the consequences, right? Normally, you've been preaching to us that the good man will be rewarded and the bad man will be punished. But really, in the world, we see the good man being punished and the bad man being rewarded. So let's reverse the consequences. Tell me why I should believe that if it truly matters to be moral, then I should be moral even if I'm tortured, as opposed to being immoral even if I'm endlessly rewarded for being immoral. Pretty cool thought experiment, no? All right, let's move along. Yeah, if the consequences don't matter, I should prefer A. Prove why I should. A over B. Okay, so here comes Plato's really interesting answer. Plato makes an analogy between the society and the individual. In the Republic, he calls it the state and soul. The state, the state of the union, the state, a nation state, right, is a country, right? So the society is the state, and the individual for Plato was the soul. Socrates used that, the care of the soul, the care of who you are, right? What matters to you. Right. So the state soul analogy is a society individual analogy. And that's Plato's answer. So Plato says something like, and don't forget, you could click on the microphone if you ever want to review this without watching the whole video. You could just go through the slides, the PowerPoint slides, and click on whichever slide you want to hear my video on. And you might want to just hear that because that's something I said maybe 3 years ago or something when I first recorded that. I'm using the same slides and they have these videos embedded, these audio files embedded in them. All right. So Plato says, okay, look, sometimes, you know what analogies are good for. When you don't see a certain point in an individual case, if there's some kind of comparable, analogous, similar case where you can see the point more readily, then we make the analogy with that and we say, hey, you didn't get my point over here, but look at this analogy, right? And then you go, oh, I see your point. And then I can see how it applies here, right? That's what analogies are for. They're not proofs, they're guides to understanding, all right? And Plato believes, of course, in helping philosophers and students of philosophy improve their understanding through reasoning, right? So that's what this analogy is for. And another thing that he says about this particular analogy is sometimes we don't see something in a small case, right? Because it's too small to see. But if we look at it in a much larger case, because it's so visible in the large case, then we could see the point. And then by analogy, we could bring it back to the smaller case, right? So he says the society is almost like an individual on a grand scale, because the society in some sense is like a collective individual made up of all of us, right? So a society has a kind of mind and a body and a will and all that other kind of thing. So he says, let's look at the society and let's see the pattern. And then we could see that same pattern in the individual. And that's his society individual analogy, or his state soul analogy, okay? So he says, let's look at a healthy society and an unhealthy society, and then we'll compare them with a healthy individual and an unhealthy individual. So in a healthy society or a healthy state, it's a well-ordered, like a healthy society is a well-ordered one, right? Not like some crazy, lawless society. It's healthy, it's harmonious, right? Think of like maybe if you've ever driven outside of Brooklyn, right, to like Pennsylvania or Delaware or some other state. This was an experience that I first had when I was younger. And I drove out of New York down to Virginia to visit some relatives. And like, everybody was so civilized. And like the light turned green, and I was at the light, there was a few cars in front of me and people didn't start going right. I started beeping the horn, right? And like, everybody looked at me like, everybody was so much more civilized than me. People stopped to let people cross the street. People I didn't know would say, good morning, howdy, neighbor, and all that. I was like, what the hell kind of civilized, well-ordered, healthy society am I in? I'm a Brooklynite. Get the hell out of my way, right? So, but the point is, think of a well-ordered society. What's a healthy society? Is one where everybody's respectful, friendly, people aren't out to kill each other, they're nice to each other, right? That's the idea. In a well-ordered, it's well-structured, it's harmonious, it's healthy, it's enthusiastic, people are friendly, right? In such a society, Plato said there's a kind of top-down order, right? What does he mean by that? Okay, well, you've got the lawmakers, the government, the legislators who are enlightened in like a good society. In a bad society, the people in control are arbitrary and capricious and selfish and vicious, and they make laws to serve their own selfish interests, right? But in like a kind of enlightened society, you've got people like Thomas Jefferson and whatnot who trying to make laws and constitutions that benefit everybody so that there'll be a kind of well-ordered, happy society, right? So Plato says in a well-ordered society, you've got kind of enlightened philosopher kings who understand human nature and who understand law and order and who make the rules to benefit everybody so that everybody has maximal well-being, right? They make the rules that benefit the entire society because that's their purpose, right? To govern society well and make society flourish and be healthy, okay? Underneath them are educated law enforcers who enforce the rules. The military, the police, the courts, and so on, right? And judges and lawyers and all the people in between the lawmakers and the law. And the citizens are the law enforcers, right? And they are taking the wisdom and guidance and rules of the lawmakers and enforcing them and making sure that they use their power to regulate the citizenry of the society and make sure it's functioning in accordance with these wisdom-based laws designed to make everyone happy. And then at the bottom level are the educated, law-abiding citizens who live happily in accordance with the laws, right? In a well-ordered society, the citizens are educated enough to understand the laws and to be able to recognize and realize that the laws are in their own self-interest so that they don't oppose them, right? And everybody lives happily ever after. All right, now in Plato's Republic, he says an awful lot about the educational system that would be required, which includes the liberal arts, to make everybody fit into a well-ordered society. Oh, I'll tell you one of his brilliant educational ideas while we're on the topic. Plato thought that in the early years, like early years of grammar school, or maybe the entirety of grammar school, teachers' primary task would be to try to let children play with different kinds of knowledge and learning and skills development, art, music, whatever, sports, science, math, and so on, right? To see what each child is naturally gifted at, right? So you let children have freedom in their learning to see what they naturally gravitate towards and are good at. Remember the Ikigai diagram? What do you love and what are you good at? Right? And though when teachers recognize that, then their job would be to encourage those students to pursue those careers. And then for the rest of their education, society's job, the educator's job, is to teach that student how to become the perfect X, whatever X is, lawyer, doctor, musician, architect, poet, whatever it is, whatever their gift is, to help them cultivate that gift. And then Plato says, if society and education does that, then every single member of society will wind up in their ideal ikigai. He doesn't use the word, but he's got the concept, right? And if every single human being in society winds up finding their reason for being, their ikigai, right? Then you will absolutely have a harmonious, well-ordered society. But for individuals to find that, the societal structure has to support that. So you need a society made out of all individuals who are totally, perfectly well developed to find their purpose for being, right? Their calling, their gift on the one hand, but you need a society that structures the possibility of that happening and supports its happening. So you need individuals who are maximally virtuous, and you need a well-ordered society to enable them to become that way. You need both. And the only way to do that, Plato says, is to educate the next generation so that when they grow up, the ills and diseases and biases and prejudices and stupidity of the previous generation will just simply disappear as the new generation reaches this kind of utopia. It's a brilliant idea, and that's the spirit behind the liberal arts. 2,400 years ago, Plato in the Republic. I highly recommend that you read it whenever you get a chance. Okay, but this is a top-down model. Look at the arrow on the left, the blue one going down. The lawmakers create the structure of society. The law enforcers make sure that they regulate society to be in line with that vision that benefits the society and every individual in it. And then the law-abiding citizens comply, right? The consumers and producers. It's a brilliant model of a well-ordered society, a healthy society. Now look at the unhealthy society and on the other side, the right side of the board there, where the arrow is pointing up. So in a poorly ordered, unhealthy, chaotic society, there is a bottom-up structure instead of a top-down structure, right? The laws and the lawmakers are ignorant or ignored by the people, or they're controlled by corruption, right? Crooked politicians, lobbyists, big pharma, the military industrial complex, all those kind of criticisms, right? That like government is in the hands of big business and everything else, right? So powerful corrupting forces really kind of overwhelm the government. They're underneath the government, but they're controlling the government. They've made a puppet out of the government. Level 2, law enforcement is corrupt or absent. There's really no rule of law. You might want to think of a ghetto where you got the gangs and the drug dealers and you got the crooked cops and like they're in cahoots and like there's lawlessness on the street, right? And then at the bottom, you've got the uneducated masses and ignorant mobs, right? Which kind of control everything with their riots and their chaos and their, foolishness and ignorance and consumerism and everything else, right? So unfortunately, our society, if we had to pick just one or the other, the left side of the board or the right side of the board, well, we're guided by the visions on the left side. But the reality is that we look a lot like we're more on the right side, right? But in any event, regardless of our present society, Plato looked at a whole bunch of different societies and analyzed them and used them as examples and came up with this kind of metric to say what a good society is and what a bad society is. And in a bad society, there's an absence of top-down order and control, right? Unconscious, ignorant forces, from the bottom control the governmental structure. Okay, so that's on the societal level in the society individual analogy, right? What is a good society? One that has a top-down structure. What's a bad society? One that has a bottom-up structure. Top-down is lawmakers, law enforcers, and law-abiding citizens. Bottom-up is uneducated citizens massively manipulate law enforcement, which manipulates the people who have whatever little power they have left. Okay, that's on the societal or state level. On the next slide, we're going to look at the soul or the individual level and make the analogy. Here it comes. So you've got an healthy individual or soul on the left and an unhealthy one on the right. In a well-ordered, healthy, harmonious individual, there is a similar top-down order, according to Plato. Reason, like the lawmakers, chooses what's wholesome. What are the values to pursue? What principles should we follow? What rules will benefit the individual person? How should I live my life? According to what principles, what philosophy? What's my philosophy of life? What matters to me? What's sacred, holy, and good, and true, and beautiful, and worth pursuing, right? That's all a function of reason. Reason is analogous to the lawmakers on the societal level in the individual. The will, my moral will, right, endorses those values and enforces them in choosing desires to act on or control. My reason tells me what's worth pursuing, what's worth desiring, what's worth wanting, and my will supports the things that I should want in a well-ordered individual, right? My will listens to my reason rather than to my animalistic instincts and base desires, right? Those are at the bottom. My desires and my actions are only allowed to occur when they are in accordance with the rules that I impose on myself, my own values, beliefs, goals, purposes, sense of self, right? My considered judgments, right? Reason dictates what my will should support, and my will supports those things. I have the kind of will and actions that I want to have, and those are in line with my individualized laws for myself, so to speak, to make the analogy. Reason gives me principles for living a philosophy of life. My will approves or disapproves of things that are in accordance with my reason or not. And I act on those things that I approve of, and only those things. And I control and regulate my animalistic or ignorant desires that will oppose my grand vision for my own life. That's in a healthy individual. There's harmony in the soul, Plato says. Just like there's harmony in the society. And just like there's no harmony in a chaotic society, likewise in an unhealthy individual or soul, right? You've got chaos, and there's a bottom-up structure. See the blue arrow on the left pointing down, healthy, bottom up on the right, unhealthy. My reason, my values, my principles, my rules are ignored by the rest of my being. I'm controlled by my desires, my cravings, my impulses, and my addictions. My will is uninformed by my values, or it's entirely absent or controlled immediately by the strongest desires. Right? I'm a mess. My desires are in charge. My cravings, my impulses, my animalistic addictions immediately issue indiscriminately in my actions. And Plato says that individual is suffering from disintegration. Their ego, their self, their personality is disintegrated. It's not integrated, whereas the healthy individual is completely integrated. Reason integrates their entire mind, body, emotions, desires, everything. In the unhealthy individual, there's disintegration, just like there's disintegration in a society that doesn't really have the proper structure and spirit, right? Inner chaos. So that's Plato's state soul analogy. It's freaking brilliant 2,400 years ago, right? And let's get back to the question. Why should I be moral? Because I myself will be an integrated, wholesome, flourishing, healthy human being. I will have internal harmony. I will not be at war with myself. I will be a real person, a genuine moral agent who's internally consistent, coherent, valuable, and meaningful. In the absence of that, I myself will deteriorate. So it's intrinsically valuable to me to grasp onto intrinsic values, and it's intrinsically painful and disintegrative for me to latch on to negative values. Right? Brilliant answer. So even if I have the ring of Gyges, I should be good for my own sake. Call it selfish, but it's a different kind of selfish, right? It's the desire to be harmonious and wholesome and integrated and coherent and have a life that's meaningful, as opposed to what the person who abuses the ring would do, which is to be completely selfish in a degenerating, self-disintegrating, valueless kind of way. Okay. Pretty cool answer. Okay. Compare something from moral psychology that you might have learned if you took an intro to psych class or a sociology class and personality development. Lawrence Kohlberg is the founder of this kind of moral psychology model that says that there are 3 stages, right, of moral psychological development or personality development. In the first stage, when you're like, a little kid, right, in the infantile stage, you have not learned yet the conventions, which are the values and norms. Remember that word nomos from the pre-Socratics, the sophists, the norms, the conventions of society. The conventions are the norms, right? If you're an infant, you're at a pre-conventional stage. You haven't learned what your society values and what its rules and values and principles are, right? It's all about me, right? Speaking of selfish, right? Me, I want. You see the little kid in the supermarket, yeah, crying, demanding, kicking its feet, screaming, I want that candy, right? And then the stupid parent that gives the kid the candy or the toy or whatever it is, right? Reinforcing the negative behavior, right? That's stage 1. Feeding desires without reason. I want, gimme. It's infantile demand for infinite, instant satisfaction of desire, right? I have a hunger, feed me, right? Without any thought of the consequences. Next level is mature, the conventional level. I think kids around 7 start to get this, right? So instead of me, it's us, what we want, and it's about cooperation, right? Prior to that, I don't want to share. I don't want to play. I don't want this. It's all about me. I'll bite you and everything else. But by the time I'm 7, I realize, well, if I bite you, you're liable to bite me back. I don't want to be bite. All right, I'll share. We could play together. Yeah. It's about us. I have to negotiate social space. I have to be a member of an extended community. It's not all about me. It's about us, right? Right. Compromise. And then when you're an adult, you may or may not ever reach the 3rd stage, according to Kohlberg, but it's a kind of post-conventional, right? The middle stage is the conventional stage. You realize, oh, I'm in the game with others, right? I have to play by the rules. Okay, I got to compromise a little bit. Not only about me. If it's always all about me, then they're never going to give me what I want anyway. So it's kind of like in my own selfish interest to cooperate. Okay, right? But in the post-adult stage, right, beyond simple maturity or beyond simple conventionalism is the post-conventional level where you become independent and you could use your own reason, right, to figure things out. Like when you're in the conventional stage, you're just knowing like, all right, this is the rule, I better comply or else. That's the consequences thing that Plato's brothers are talking about, right? But if you ever reach a higher philosophical level that not many adults do, then you're capable of reasoning for yourself like Martin Luther King did and say, yeah, there's a kind of hypocrisy in the rules. All men are created equal except not Black men. What? Wait a second. Reason tells me that if all men are created equal, Black men are men, there's something wrong with the way those rules are being implemented, right? So that's being able to think for yourself, right? Instead of just going by what's called group think, which is the conventional level is, what is the group think, right? Well, what makes sense using reason? That's the 3rd stage, right? You're not obeying as a mere compromise. You understand the rules and you can revise them based on reason itself. It's all about understanding, right? And then at this stage, it's a kind of what we call enlightened self-interest, that it's really in everybody's interest for us to cooperate and not be selfish. That works out the best for all of us. So the most selfish strategy is to kind of be unselfish, even if and even though that satisfies everybody's selfish interests the most. It's a kind of paradox, but it works, right? Not everybody gets it. I wouldn't want to be mistreated, so neither does anyone else. So reciprocity, if I treat others well, they'll treat me well. Oh, So I have a selfish reason for being nice to others. Oh, okay. So that's what we call enlightened self-interest, right? It's good in itself to treat everyone else good or equally. Okay. So now I said earlier that this idea of ethical egoism, right? Think back, there's prescriptive egoism and descriptive. Descriptive egoism, also known as psychological egoism, says all human beings are always selfish. Prescriptive or ethical egoism says all human beings ought to be selfish all the time, right? And almost every philosopher, except the one in the title of the book there, Ayn Rand, not Ayn Rand, Ayn Rand, she's Russian, emigrated to the United States. Almost all philosophers throughout history have advocated unselfishness equals moral. Ayn Rand is the first one, I believe, who ever said that selfishness equals moral, right? And you might want to read that book, The Virtue of Selfishness by Ayn Rand, right? Is selfishness bad? Everyone says so. Religion, society, school, family, not Ayn Rand. She advocates ethical egoism, the claim, the theory that egoism or self-interest is your moral obligation. Some reasons why in the last two bullets, well, you're closest to your own needs. And if we all take care of ourselves and our own needs because we're closest to ourselves, we'll all do better. What's the alternative? Each one of us kind of donates or gifts all of our resources into some collective societal pot or till or whatever you want to call it. And some government bureaucrats decide what's the best way to distribute all those resources, right? Imagine everything that you ever make in terms of money, the government takes it all, and then they decide who should get what based on their calculations on who needs what. Right? Well, Ayn Rand says, no, that violates individual rights. When I work and make value in the form of money or in trade or anything else, the value added, and this is John Locke's theory of property, which is the value added theory of property. John Locke said, I am myself. I own my body and I own my efforts. So when I make efforts and improve something, I add value to it, and I own the added value. The way he used a simple metaphor of mixing my hands with the soil, like when you plant something and it grows and you created an apple tree or whatever, you put your efforts into, you mixed your hands with the soil and created the added value of the apple tree. So you own that apple tree. You created that added value, so it's yours. If you build a house, other people can't just come in and go, oh, what a nice house, I'm going to go sleep there. No, you created it, so you own it. That's his theory of property. And Ayn Rand agrees with the property theory and extends it to wealth of any kind and says, when you make any wealth that you make of any form, whether it's property, money, or a factory, a pizzeria, no matter what it is, any money or profit or value from it that you created is yours. And it's not up to someone else, the government, which is just some abstraction of people like you, to take your wealth and everybody else's wealth and redistribute it according to some conception that they have about who deserves it. It's yours. You deserve it, right? So you should keep it. So taxation should, at most, this is what we call a libertarian or a freedom, liberty is freedom, a freedomist view, right? The government's only legitimate role is to protect your freedom, right? And the minimal tax that you should pay for that is to pay for them as a security service with the court system to penalize anybody who tries to rob you of your freedom or cheat you in a business deal or assault you or anything else like that, right? We're all rational agents in a well-ordered, ideal society. That's the limited purpose of government, is to protect your rights. The government doesn't give you rights. You give it the right to protect your interests, and that's it, right? So, like, it's good to be selfish. There's nothing wrong with advocating for your own interests and your values and your property that you create. They're yours, right? And if everybody does that, society will be wonderful, right? That's the Ayn Rand view, and it's called ethical egoism, but her larger philosophy is called objectivism because she thinks there are objective reasons why her ethics and everything else that she advocates makes sense, okay? Now, the contrast is Marxism, right? Or you could say Ayn Rand's version, what we just talked about is individualism, individual rights, right? The state, the government has no right to take my goods and give them to other people who might happen to be more needy than me. But socialism says what Karl Marx is quoted in the left side of the board there, quote, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs, end of quote. This is the major principle of Marxism or socialism or collectivism. The collective matters more than the individual, right? Society matters more than you do, right? You're a sacrificial lamb for society, according to socialism. Your only value is what you can give to society. From each according to his ability. What are you able to produce, right? You're a plumber, a carpenter, a painter, a truck driver, whatever it is that you're able to do, an inventor. You should do all that and create all that value for society, and society will give it, quote, to each, to everyone else, according to his needs, right? So people who can't work for a living or who are too lazy to work for a living or whatever, they have needs. You're able to produce things that will satisfy their needs. So your job is to be a slave, so to speak, devoting all your value, your hands mixing with the soil, to create goods that society can give to other people who don't have your abilities to give, but they have mouths to feed, right? Now, in case you haven't noticed, that's my personal view, right? The slant that I'm putting on this is that Marxism violates individual rights. That's just Professor Rappetti's personal view, right? And there are many moral reasons why people will see a great moral value in socialism, right? Because that's been the view that humanity has had throughout almost all of human history, and almost every religion says, you know, there's a Star Trek movie where Spock goes to give his life. He's going to go and steps inside a nuclear reactor. He's about to die, and he's on the glass, and his friends are trying to tell him, come out of this, Spock, but he's sacrificing his life by jumping on the grenade. And he says, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, right? That's a collectivist idea, right? All the goods go into a societal pot. Government redistributes. Everyone is made equal. This is called equality of outcomes, right? Your personal interests are less important than everyone else's needs and interests. This is collectivism. Society bigger than you. Things bigger than you matter more than you. They're bigger than you. You're smaller. You're just little you, right? And in the last bullet on the page, equality of outcomes. Everybody winds up with an equal share. Matters more than equality or inequality of effort. You make all the effort, and the lazy hippie bums who live next door to you lie on the beach all day long, smoking pot and listening to music and eating pizza, right? You got to work to feed them. That's socialism in Professor Rappetti's view. And I'm not telling you what to think, right? I'm just giving you my own opinion. All right, so this is Professor Rappetti's critique of socialism. And this is what happens in philosophy. Your professors, you will have professors who are socialists, right? In fact, most of your professors will probably be socialists. And some of them, very few of them, like me, will be individualists or libertarians, right? And because almost none of your professors ever advocate individualism or libertarianism, that's why I think I have a kind of license to preach it at you, even though I'm telling you, don't listen to me, form your own opinions, all right? But this is like, since this is one of my many tangents, I said, oh, sorry, it's a tangent. Let's get back to the main point. But the main point was whether or not we should be selfish, right? And so one of the things that a good philosophy professor will do, and I think I've mentioned this in previous lectures, is to try to get you to adopt the lens that you're trying to consider, put the glasses on of that philosophy and look through them as if that's your view, that's your perspective, that's your paradigm, right? Put the purple glasses on so you can see the world as if it's all purple, right? So since you're used to, in this day and age, most students are more exposed to collectivist and socialist thinking, Professor Rapetti is challenging you to think outside the box and put the individualist glasses on and think that for a change, perhaps there are good reasons to be self-interested and concerned with your own selfish well-being, right? If you want your life to be a success, it's not gonna be unless you take care of yourself, right? So this is a kind of collectivist argument. This is the final thing I'll say about collectivism versus socialism before we move on. Here's a socialistic or collectivistic argument in favor of individualism or egoism, ethical egoism, the idea that you should be selfish. Everyone's closest to their own interests and needs. Just from a bureaucratic or logistics point of view, for everyone to give all their resources into a collective societal pool and have a couple of ignorant, as most politicians are, bureaucrats distribute those goods according to their own schemes to all the millions of human beings who know their own interests better than government does, is going to mess things up as it always has done historically. Everyone, the collective, the majority, most, as Spock said, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. The needs of the many will be most efficiently satisfied if everyone takes care of themselves. So there's a collectivist argument for individualism. All right, but look, every now and then I get carried away with my preaching, but I insist that those are, I distinguish between Professor Rapetti's own personal arguments and opinions and values and how you should think, right? I'm challenging how you do think so that I can encourage you to take on alternate ways of thinking. The more important lesson is not that you should think this or that or agree with Professor Rapetti. I don't care if you agree with me or disagree with me, but what I do care about is that you're open-minded enough to consider the opposite. Like I said, take any view that you think is correct, flip it, reverse it, negate it, put it upside down, inside out, step outside the box, put it on, take it on, imagine that it's true, and then have a better perspective about it. All right. All right. What else we got left here? Oh, okay. So those arrows they'll make sense in a moment. So let's do another thought experiment. Okay. So, on the previous couple of slides, I was arguing for egoism, but now I'm going to argue again. Like I said, there are collectivist reasons to be egoists, but there are also, this is why I say try to look at everything from every possible angle. There are egoistic or selfish reasons to be unselfish or altruistic. And now that's what we're considering, right? That's what you're supposed to do in philosophy. Consider the pros, make the best argument you can for them, then consider the cons, make the best argument you can for them, and then compare both and ask which one makes the most sense for you and why, right? Okay, so we call this concept that I'm about to unfold for you enlightened self-interest. Enlightened self-interest is the idea, which I already mentioned earlier, that from a more enlightened perspective, it's in your self-interest to be unselfish, but it's okay. Unlike the game where we play, you have a behavior that looks like it's unselfish, but we can prove that you're really selfish. So what? From the point of view of enlightened self-interest, everybody should be self-interested, like Ayn Rand says. But if you are enlightened about your self-interest, then you'll realize that everyone ought to not only be self-interested, but be cooperative and unselfish, because being cooperative and unselfish is in everyone else's and your own self-interest. That's the most enlightened view. Okay, so now I'm going to walk through it. We're simplifying here on the chart that you're about to see by dividing the world into me and everyone else. See the two columns there, me and everyone else? And there'll be 4 rows. And so those are 4 different scenarios according to which either me or everyone else is either selfish or unselfish. Okay? So we're going to go through these 4 logical possibilities. Like there are more, but we're simplifying, right? It might be where, like in row number 1, I'm selfish, but everyone else is unselfish, right? But it could be like where I'm 75% of the time I'm selfish, and like maybe 80% of everyone else is unselfish, whatever, right? But so those, like, you know, in reality, it never works out this way, but this is what you call a kind of metric, a thought experiment, where we just imagine, what if I was the only selfish person and everyone else was unselfish? There was a movie, I think it was called Liar, Liar or something like that, with Jim Carrey, where I forget what it was called, something like that, where everybody in the society always told the truth. And then Jim Carrey accidentally fell upon the possibility of lying. But he was in a society where everybody else was, let's say, like unselfish, trusting and truthful, cooperative. And so when everybody expects that of everybody else, he goes into the bank and he says to the trusting bank teller, "Oh, I forgot my bank book at home. I'm sorry, but I want to take out $35,000. Oh, no problem." She gives him the $35,000, right? Even though he doesn't have that money in the account. If everybody else is truthful and you're the only one who lies and nobody ever expects it, you could take over society, right? So by analogy, if you're the only one who's selfish, but everyone else is completely unselfish, you're the only one who's uncooperative and everybody else is completely cooperative, that seems to be the ideal world, right? Because everybody else has to be moral and considerate and caring and unselfish and cooperative, and you get to do whatever the hell you want. So at the buffet table, you can just go ahead and jump in front of anybody else, take all the crab legs, right, and not care about it, and everybody won't even notice it because they're so cooperative and unselfish, and you know, they'll just move out of your way, they'll accommodate you, and right. So like ideally, that seems to be the best option that anybody would want. Everybody seems to be someone, if we're all really naturally selfish, who would want row 1, where you are the only selfish person in your entire world, and everybody else is completely unselfish, cooperative, trusting, honest, friendly, considerate, loyal, generous, forgiving, you name it, right? Okay, now let's look at the next possibility. Yeah, that's ideal, best for me, all the benefits of society without any responsibilities. I can lie, cheat, steal, etc. Nobody will call me on it because they're all perfect. Everyone's truthful, fair, generous, kind, friendly. Society, we have a society, a completely wonderful society. It's a well-ordered society with all the societal goods, schools, bridges, hospitals, you name it, right? Everything's clean. People clean up after themselves. You don't, someone else will clean up after you, right? I mean, that's the perfect society for a selfish person, right? Okay. Now, I'll go through the next best one. The next best one is where you are also unselfish, but so is everyone else, right? Like, what if you couldn't have a society where everybody was unselfish except for you? Well, the next best bet would be you still want to be in that wonderful society where everybody's perfect, but you also have to be perfect. All right, it's a little bit of a compromise, but if you can't have it, row 1, the next best bet is you want to keep that wonderful society, so you also have to play by the rules, right? It's not the best, but it's the second best, right? And as far as everybody else, they're the same. Nothing changed on the right side of the board. Everyone else in options 1 and 2 is the same. They're all unselfish. But if you couldn't have option 1, the next best bet is option 2. Now I have an arrow coming down from option 1 to arrow 3, which is you're selfish and everyone else is selfish. Now, if that's the case, you're in a dog-eat-dog world of chaos. No society or law, right? The strong rule the weak. As Thomas Hobbes said, you're in a state of nature where life is nasty, short, and brutish, right? And that's everybody else is that way, right? If everybody's selfish and you're selfish, it's a dog-eat-dog world. It's every man for himself, and every man is threatened by every other man, and it's a battle of wills with absolutely no moral rules, no laws, no nothing. You could think you're doing great. In the middle of the night, you could wake up and the barbarians could be at the gate, ready to rape, pillage, torture, and burn your village to the ground or your home or whatever it is, right? So, and you might not have realized this, but everybody wants option 1, right? Just like you. They're all rational and selfish. Because they're all selfish, they all want the same thing. Everybody wants option 1. But if everybody goes for option 1, you'll drop down to option 3. Everyone is selfish, right? And then, but that's no society anymore, right? At least in options 1 and 2, you have an ideal society, model society. Law, order, institutions, libraries, buses, chemistry, medicine, vaccines, you name it, all the good stuff, right? But if everybody's completely selfish, you drop down into an uncivilized state of nature. You're not in a state of society. You're in a dog-eat-dog. You're in a jungle, right? So that's why the arrow from 1 goes to 3, because everybody's selfish, right? But because we're rational, you see an arrow coming up from 3 to 2. Because we're rational, we all realize, well, we don't want to be in a dog-eat-dog world. All right, I'll compromise. I won't be a selfish bastard completely. I guess I'll have to toe the line like everybody else. And that's how we keep on the second row. We're in a society, it's a compromise. It's in all of our rational, enlightened self-interest to be unselfish and cooperative and play by the rules, right? So that's what the arrows represent. Because we're not only selfish, if we were only selfish, we'd degenerate to number 3 immediately. But because we're also rational, we're intelligent, we realize we don't want to be in 3, and number 2 is a compromise. That's what society is. Society is number 2, it's a compromise. We all want to be selfish, but if too many of us are selfish, the game will collapse and we'll be in a jungle of all against all, right? My sword versus yours, right? That's enlightened self-interest. Because we're rational, intelligent, and enlightened, we realize that it's in our self-interest to be cooperative and unselfish. So we have selfish reasons to be collectivists in a certain way, okay? Right, so I made the argument against Marxism, and now I'm making a kind of egoistic argument for collectivism, which is kind of like Marxism, but not exactly. Right, there needs to be a balance. Libertarians who believe in enlightened self-interest will say, okay, so we need to have a government that has minimal power, the power to preserve law and order, and that's it. Not all these welfare social programs that pay for all kinds of crap that, you know, because my neighbors are too lazy to work and get it for themselves, I got to work extra hours to pay for them, right? That's not row 2, right? So, of course, philosophers across the political spectrum debate about row 2 and whether or not row 2 should have social welfare programs or be completely based on merit, right? That taxes should only be for paying for government to do only protection of people's liberties, right? That's the debate between relatively the left and the right. The right, the conservatives, the Republicans tend to think government should be minimal, And the left, the Democrats, the progressives think that government should pay for everything. Education, housing, medical, you name it, everybody, equal outcomes, right? So this is the political arena. Okay. One last thing. Here's the worst scenario. Everybody else is selfish, but you're the only unselfish. These are all the four logical possibilities, right? So look at the right side. You have two options, 1 and 2, where everyone's unselfish, and 3 and 4, two options where everyone's selfish. This is just logical computation, right? There's you and everyone else, and there's selfish or unselfish. So that's two sets of two. So there are four logical possibilities. In the first two, on the right side, everyone's unselfish except you. You're either selfish or unselfish. And on the bottom two options, everyone's selfish except for you, and you can either be selfish or unselfish. So the worst case scenario, morally speaking, and psychologically and personally speaking, is where you're in a completely selfish world where there are no laws and you're the only schnook who tries to be moral. And I say schnook because there's really no interpersonal or social reason for you to be good, for you to be honest and truthful when nobody else is, because you're being taken advantage of, right? However, as we'll learn in a later lecture, Confucius found himself in row 4 and went around risking his life, being unselfish, and trying to convince people in ancient China that they belong in row 2, right? And his life was threatened. He had to hightail it out of many different little warlords, little principalities and territories and kingdoms to save his behind, right? But he managed eventually to convince enough people that option 3 stunk and option 2 would bring back civilization. And he succeeded. And China has been a very well-ordered civilization ever since. Okay. So one of my anecdotes about row 4 is the Kingsborough bus stop. Now, some of you have been remote from day one during the pandemic and never had to step foot on campus at Kingsborough. But for those of you who've ever stepped foot on Kingsborough's campus, you know that on your way home, you might come from a nice neighborhood where people line up nicely on a line at the bus stop. You get on the bus, you take your turn, you get on, you get your seat, or you have to stand if you're on the back of the line, whatever. But on the way home at the Kingsborough bus stop, everybody leaving the college clusters around the bus. There's no line. The door opens up. It's a bum rush. It's chaos. It's a dog-eat-dog world. Everybody, perhaps except you, is being totally selfish and inconsiderate. And if you don't compete with them and act like a dog in the dog-eat-dog world, which is the battle to get on the bus and possibly get a seat, you won't even get on the bus, even if you were the first person there. So if you find yourself in row 4, you have a moral excuse for being immoral because everybody else is being immoral. However, if there are circumstances under which you can maintain moral integrity, even in row 4, like Confucius, you might turn the world around. All right, Professor Rapetti preaching to you again about being kind of caring for the collective, for the good of society. Okay. Yeah, you don't want to be the only schnook at the bus stop. Right? All right, so yeah, row 4 is the same as row 3 in terms of everybody else. It's a lawless jungle, right? If everybody's stealing, lying, cheating, violent, whatever, your reasons for being moral, most moral reasons are interpersonal. So if the people around you aren't observing the rules, they can't expect you to observe them towards them. But like, again, you could be the Confucius who could turn society around. Okay, here's another interesting little thing called the paradox of self-interest. Just to remind you, we're talking about Plato and Gyges' ring. Do we have reasons to be moral, cooperative, unselfish, regardless of consequences, right? We delved into this and that, and you might have forgotten the theme. All right, so the question is about, should we be egoistic or self-interested? So here's what we call the paradox of self-interest, right? And look at the little picture with the flowers. Someone says, I just want to be happy. Girls just want to have fun. There's nothing wrong with wanting to have fun or just wanting to be happy, right? But imagine a person who doesn't want to do anything, but just wants to be happy. All right. One of my children went through a phase where no matter what I offered to do to entertain him at that age of his life, I'm not in the mood for that. I just want to be happy. I don't want to do that. I just want to be happy. Well, how about we do this? How about we go bowling? How about we go see a movie? How about we go on the Circle Line? How about we go to a museum? What about Central Park? What about a boat ride? What about a horseback ride? What about mini golf? What about this? What about video games? Nah, I'm not in the mood. I just want to be happy. I just want to be happy. I wanted to smack him. All right. So it's a kind of pure self-interest. I just want me to be happy, but I don't want to have to do anything to make me happy, right? Okay, so there's some of those examples I was talking about, one of my children, right? It was just a phase. No, I just want to be happy, right? But here's the thing, if you only pursue happiness itself, you can never attain it, right? Happiness generally comes as a byproduct of doing the things that you enjoy, things that are enriching to you, things that are edifying to you, things that challenge you, things that are interesting to you, right? So there's the Ikigai advice: find a career doing what you love and what you're good at and what pays for you and what the world needs, right? Then you'll really be happy, right? Happiness is from being a certain way, right? Content with life. Set your life up and your values up the right way, right? Of course, having certain things and experiencing certain things can kind of lead toward moments of happiness, but enduring happiness, we'll see more about this when we get to Aristotle, is more about a state of being than a state of having or moments of experiencing things. All right, so it's called the paradox of self-interest, because if you pursue your own happiness directly, right? Remember the difference between intrinsic and instrumental goods. Happiness is the only intrinsic good. Everything else that leads to it is an instrumental good. But you can't pursue happiness directly. It never works, right? You can get happiness by pursuing other things that you like for their own sake, whether it's golf, chess, swimming, whatever it is, doesn't matter. All right. This is just something for you to think about at this point in your life. The paradox of just wanting to be happy never works, ironically. Okay. Is everyone actually interested? So this term a priori, it's a Latin phrase, which means prior to. And what that means is prior to observation or experience, prior to using your senses. In other words, is something true by definition alone, true by meaning alone, true by the sense of what the concepts mean themselves, right? Like 1 + 1 is 2 is a priori true, meaning it's true by definition alone. But John has 1 apple and Mary has 2, right? Those are not true by definition alone. They're not true prior to looking at John and Mary, right? They're a priori true only if they're true by meaning alone, right? So a famous philosopher, David Hume, and we're jumping into the modern age just to make a point, said that reason alone cannot generate an action. Think about it. Without a motive, a desire, a goal, an intention, a purpose, nothing moves you to act. Every action is therefore motivated or goal-oriented, right? By me, and there's my motive, right, in the pictures. So each of us always acts, this is an argument, each of us always acts on our own intention or motive. Whenever I act, I'm pursuing some motive of mine. I'm moving towards some goal or desire that I want to fulfill. I never act on your motive. unless I adopt it as my own. Oh, I like you, you want that, and so I'm going to help you try to get that. Now it's my desire to help you to try to get that. So it's still my motive to try to help you to get that, right? So whenever I act intentionally as opposed to sneezing or falling, right? Anything that I ever do, any action I ever perform is always goal-oriented, and it's motivated by my own motive, right? So I always act on my own motives, right? In which case, it's a priori true that everyone acts in self-interest, right? A, and B, satisfaction of the motive, right? Whenever I succeed on executing my motive, right? Satisfaction of the motive occurs upon successful execution of the motive. So whenever I succeed in acting on one of my motives, right, I get satisfaction. So I perform an action with a motive, and when I succeed, I get the satisfaction of having acted on that motive, right? So there I am once again. And so are you, and so is everyone else, always and everywhere, endlessly acting on our own motives and getting satisfaction when we succeed to act on those motives and execute them efficiently, right? As opposed to being thwarted. So I could try something, I'm acting on my motive, but I fail, and so I get a negative feedback. Oh, I didn't get what I wanted, me. There's me in the circle, and there's my motive right underneath me in the puzzle, right? So opposite of a priori, right? What's true by definition prior to looking at experience is what's true a posteriori. Posterior is behind or after, right? So true based on experience, right? So like I said, I can know that 1 + 1 is 2 without looking at apples and counting them, right? But I can only know how many apples John has by looking at John, right? After observing or experiencing John and how many apples he has, can I know a posteriori whether or not it's true that he has 3 apples, right? That's called the a priori is what's true by definition alone, and a posteriori is what's only true by observation, this 5 senses, okay? So it seems that there are many unselfish actions, right? Like we were talking about earlier. Oh, the guy who jumps on the grenade, there seem to be unselfish actions, but based on experience, well, that looked unselfish, that felt unselfish. I really didn't want to do it, but I did it anyway. So like there are things that from experience and observation seem unselfish, but if it's true by definition that everything we ever do is motivated by our own desires, then it can't be that there are any things that can be true a posteriori as genuinely unselfish, right? Like that would be oxymoronic. The word oxymoron is another word for contradictory, right? Like kosher ham or round square, right? Those are oxymoronic. An oxymoronic thing is a contradictory concept or object, like round square or kosher ham, right? If it's ham, it's pork. Pork is not kosher, so kosher ham is a contradiction. It's oxymoronic, right? So if your experience suggests, remember like what the rationalist said in the very first lectures, if your experience tells you something like you saw a round square, but logic tells you that that's impossible, then you didn't really see a round square. That's oxymoronic. It's contradictory. It couldn't happen, so it didn't happen, right? So this is an argument, right? Like that a priori, from meaning alone, every action is always motivated by whose motive? Yours. And whenever you succeed, you're satisfied that you performed your action. So necessarily, by definition, by logic and meaning alone, all actions are self-motivated. So if your experience tells you that one is not, that's got to be a mistake, right? But William James, famous philosopher, on my last little bullet item there, famous philosopher, psychologist, and parapsychologist, who opened up the first psychology department at Harvard in the universe, in the early 1900s. Also a parapsychologist, like a Ghostbuster, William James, one of my favorite philosophers, made an analogy to critique this idea that by definition, we're all egoists, right? He said, look, a coal burning ship, back in his day, that's what they burned to cross the Atlantic. A coal burning ship doesn't cross the Atlantic in order to burn coal, right? Even if it must burn coal in order to move and cross the Atlantic, right? Think about it. It has to burn coal to move, but it doesn't move so that it can burn coal. That gets things backwards. And his point is, by analogy, we might always have to act on our own motives in order to act, like David Hume said, you can't act without a motive, right? But it doesn't follow from that fact that the reason why we act is just because we want the satisfaction of acting on our own motives. We have to act on our own motives in order to act at all. But that does not mean that the reason why we perform the actions that we do is simply because we want the gratification of performing those actions for our own selfish benefit, right? Just like the ship. It doesn't move just because it wants to burn coal. It has to burn coal in order to move. So you have to have a motive of your own in order to act, but that doesn't mean that you act simply because you want to satisfy your motive, right? It's a pretty cool counterexample by way of analogy. Pretty subtle, but think about it. It's pretty cool. Okay, so let me end the screen share. And I apologize. I think that this was quite a long lecture, but I think it was a juicy one and quite worthy of your attention. And I hope you learned a lot. Until next time, ciao.